Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Answering Islam from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapters 3 and 4 of the book. So let's get started with chapter 3, Prophets. And just a reminder to you guys, if you, for some reason, didn't catch the first video in this series yet, in addition to summarizing Geisler and Saleeb's description of Islam, and responding to that as I'm able, as I have something of use to say, I'll also be keeping a particular lookout for areas where Islam, as they describe it, sounds similar to Christianity, because we're still in the first third of the book where they are devoting themselves not so much to commenting on or responding or critiquing Islam, but to simply attempting to describe it for us. So, they begin their description of the prophets in this chapter this way, quote, "According to Islam, prophets are needed for two basic reasons. One, humans are frail, and two, God cares for his creatures. Hence, God sends prophets to call people back to himself. Thus, the belief in God's sovereign care for his wayward creation gives rise to the belief in prophets as the bearers of his divine message." Hey, look, there's a similarity already. All three of the major Abrahamic monotheisms share this notion that God chooses to reveal his truth to certain people who are then charged with spreading that message to others. These people are called prophets. And no matter what context in which I consider the matter, Jewish, Christian, or Islamic, the notion of prophets just makes no sense to me. And I'll come back to why that is in more detail when we get to the end of this chapter. First, let's see what Geisler and Saleeb have to tell us about the role of prophets in Islam. There are two Arabic words, the authors tell us, that are roughly equivalent to our English word prophet. These words are Rasul, which means one who is sent, and Nabi, which means one who proclaims news from God. And Nabi is also the Hebrew word for prophet. These two terms are related, and sometimes they are used interchangeably, but many Muslim theologians distinguish between them, using Nabi to refer to someone who receives a divine revelation, and Rasul to refer to someone who proclaims a message based on the scriptures, but who did not actually receive a divine revelation themselves. And what I'm about to say here is my distinction, not Geisler and Saleeb's, but to me the Rasul-Nabi distinction strikes me as similar to the one that we might draw between prophet and preacher. A prophet in the religious sense is someone who receives a word supposedly from God personally, and a preacher is someone who spreads a message based on the revelations supposedly received by other people. Preachers are sometimes also called prophets, but when we think of the word prophet and what makes that term applicable to someone, that notion of having been contacted personally by God in some way is very important. So that's something that occurred to me, the Rasul Nabi prophet-preacher distinction. A few more important basics for an Islamic prophet. They must be a human being, which seems obvious, but what that means is they are not an incarnation of God. They are fully human. And this is because it's thought that only humans can serve as models for other humans, because since God is perfect and beyond all temptation, it's thought that he could not serve as good of a model for humans. Humans would be able to relate to other humans better because of our frailty and our susceptibility to temptation. A prophet is also considered to be an honorable person and of strong character and honest and intelligent, and at least largely free from sin, as free as we frail, imperfect humans can be, I suppose. Some Muslim theologians hold to a more extreme form of this view and believe that prophets are actually incapable of sinning, but whatever you think about that, these positive qualities of prophets are thought to be innate and present within their character before they receive their revelations. It's not the revelation of God that makes them honorable and honest and intelligent and sinless or mostly sinless. It's that was their innate character to begin with, and then they received the revelation of God. So why does God send prophets? To spread his message. Quote, "Two prominent aspects of prophethood are clearly expressed. First, is the belief that God has raised up an individual in each particular community to warn its people. Second is the Muslim conviction that every prophet has proclaimed the same basic message, which consists of inviting the people to acknowledge the oneness of God, submit to his laws, and do good works in view of the hereafter. This is another area where I think Islam has something in common with Christianity, especially that point about prophets proclaiming the same basic message. Now, I'm not saying that it's a common Christian belief that the prophets which are unique to Islam are genuine or carrying the same message as Christianity, because Christians don't tend to say that. But just as Muslims claim that the faiths which came before theirs, Judaism and Christianity, contain truths which then found their ultimate understanding and expression in Islam, Christians claim that the underlying message of their faith is the same as that revealed in the Jewish scriptures. And just as most Christians would reject the interpretation of their faith as being an imperfect predecessor to Islam, so would most Jews reject the similar view of their own faith espoused by Christians. Islamic prophets and the clerics and theologians who've been interpreting and propagating their words are carrying on a tradition that religions of all kinds have been practicing for as long as anyone can remember, starting with a pre-existing religion and saying, this is pretty good, but here's what they were actually trying to say. So who are the prophets? An exact number isn't stated anywhere, but a traditional estimate is that there are 124,000 prophets. That is, there have been that many throughout history. And this estimate is based on the belief that a prophet, also sometimes called an apostle, is sent to every particular community. Most of the prophets mentioned by name in the Quran are characters from the Bible. Adam, Noah, Moses, Solomon, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus, to name a few. There are also some, such as Hud, Saleeb, Idris, and Luqman, who have no equivalents in the Bible. And of course, last and greatest of all the prophets is considered to be Muhammad. Of all the prophets, there are 5 that are considered to be above the rest, the 5 greatest prophets within Islam. And they are, of course, Muhammad and Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. And they're all given titles which explain why they are viewed to be greater than other prophets. Muhammad is called the apostle of God, Noah the preacher of God, Abraham the friend of God, Moses the speaker with God, and Jesus the word of God. And Adam is also sometimes included in this list, so it would be 6 instead of 5, and Adam is called the chosen of God. Other than Muhammad, the single greatest prophet is considered to be Abraham, who the Quran describes as being neither Jew nor Christian, but someone of true faith who bowed his will to God's. Also mentioned, Muslims believe scriptures were revealed to Noah and Abraham, but that these books are no longer actually in existence. You know, speaking of that, this notion that God revealed scriptures to Noah and to Abraham, but somehow those revelations just didn't survive. I wonder if there is a concept within Islam similar to the notion I've encountered in Christianity that believes that the scriptures have been divinely preserved in some way. If so, I wonder why God decided that it was okay to lose the books revealed to Noah and Abraham. It can't be because he felt they covered too much of the same territory as other books based on his revelations, because if there's anything God doesn't seem to mind, it's repetition. Speaking of which, on the message of the prophets, Geisler and Saleeb say, quote, "The theme of most Quranic stories is almost identical. The underlying message is that throughout history, God has raised from each people a prophet or messenger. The prophet invites his people to worship the one true God. Usually, however, the majority refuse to listen to him and bring upon themselves the divine judgments of flood, fire, or earthquake, while the faithful few are spared and rewarded." And the authors go on to stress the importance of this idea in Islamic theology. The point that all prophets tell the same basic story is a very important one, since Islam positions itself not as a competitor to Judaism or Christianity, but as a successor, and frames its message as the ultimate refinement of the same message carried by those earlier faiths. It reminds me of the commonly heard and to me absurd Christian claim about the Bible, that it is not a collection of disparate, often contradictory texts, but in fact a single cohesive story. Despite its claims of being in harmony with Judaism and Christianity, Islamic scholars are aware of the tension that exists between Islam and those other faiths. One explanation for the apparent disagreements among the faiths, in terms of their traditions and scriptures and teachings, is that the revelations of the pre-Islamic religions were eventually corrupted from their true form, and that Islam is, in a sense, a correction of those corruptions, a returning of God's message to its originally intended form. It's also noted that the elements of Muhammad's message that are the most directly contradictory of Jewish or Christian teachings tend to come later. Early on, Muhammad's teachings are very positive regarding Judaism and Christianity. It's only after Muhammad's relations with Jews and Christians in his world during his life deteriorated that the message of Islam began to diverge much more significantly from those other religions. And this is another thing that Islam seems to have in common with Christianity, that as with the Bible, it makes way more sense to read and interpret the Quran as a piece of literature with an awareness of the cultural and historical context in which it originated, rather than treating it as the infallible Word of God. Under such an interpretation, conflicts like the changing attitude exhibited toward non-Muslims are easily explained. The Quran grows more hostile toward Jews and Christians because the guy who wrote the book, so to speak, saw his relationships with those communities worsen over time. If you look at the text, be it the Quran or the Bible or any other scripture, as what by all indications it is, which is a product of humans with human motivations, made for human purposes, subject to human influences and prejudices, then the theological gymnastics required to make it a harmonious and unified divine message aren't necessary. There are two common explanations within Islamic theology for how the scriptures that came before the Quran came to be corrupted. First, there's the idea that the words themselves didn't actually change, but they came to be wrongly interpreted. This was a more popular view in the early years of Islam. More recently, the second idea, that the texts themselves had actually been altered or tampered with, has become much more widely accepted. It's commonly thought that the original revelations, from those that were the basis for the Torah to those that were the basis for the Gospels, are not accurately represented in the Torah and the New Testament that we have today. Both the Jews and the Christians are said to have altered, forged, or mistakenly interpreted the revelations that they received from God. Jews and Christians are viewed as unbelievers not because Jews and Christians did not receive revelation, but because they failed to accept the revelation of Muhammad as the true and ultimate message of God. Also, the Christian belief in the divinity of Christ is considered to be blasphemous and a form of the unforgivable sin of shirk, which was discussed in the previous video. But just because Jesus isn't considered divine, that doesn't mean he isn't an important and respected figure. Jesus is considered a prophet, one of the greatest of all prophets, and he is viewed as unique in many ways within Islam. Though Muslims reject the Christian belief that Jesus was the Son of God, he is one of only two names that appears in every list of prophets in the Quran. The other is Abraham. He's referred to as the Messiah, the Word of God, the Spirit of God, and the Speech of Truth, among other titles. The Quran also affirms the virgin birth of Jesus and the claims that he performed miracles, including raising the dead back to life. And generally speaking, Jesus is treated with reverence in Islamic tradition. In the Hadith, Muhammad is recorded as saying that he is the nearest to Jesus of anyone, and that between he and Jesus there were no other prophets. So, given how special, though not divine, Jesus was in the Islamic view, what was his mission? It's a common view that Jesus was the apostle chosen by God to take his message to the nation of Israel. And this disagrees with the Christian view that the message of Jesus was meant to be universal, but it does line up with the Islamic notion that God sends a prophet to each particular community. The circumstances of the death of Jesus are much more mysterious in the Quran than in the Bible. The Quran explicitly contradicts the claim that Jesus was killed by crucifixion. Instead, it says that it was made to appear that Jesus died on the cross, but instead he was raised up to be with God, and that he will later appear as a witness on the day of judgment. Which is interesting because it's very similar to the Christian story. It just leaves out the death on the cross. It skips straight to basically the ascension and the notion that God will come back, or that Jesus will come back after the end of the world. And the Quran is not really specific about what this actually means, about what happened to Jesus. So this is a matter of some debate. Some Muslim commentators speculate that God saw to it that someone who looked like Jesus was crucified in the place of Jesus. It's suggested that God may have caused someone to appear as though they were Jesus, and then they were crucified in Jesus's place. And speculation as to the identity of this replacement for Jesus range from Judas, who seems to be a very popular choice, to Pontius Pilate. However, Geisler and Saleeb write that specific theories about how Jesus escaped the crucifixion and who may have been killed in his place on the cross are no longer so popular. Most modern Muslims consider the fate of Jesus to be a mystery and see no need to speculate beyond what little the Quran actually says, which is that people thought Jesus had died on the cross, but he had actually been raised up to God. One non-Muslim explanation for why the author or authors of the Quran might have wanted to dispute the death of Jesus is that there is a tradition of vindication for prophets of Islam. They are rejected and resisted, but ultimately they triumph. Jesus dying an ignominious death on the cross would have broken the established form of the life of a prophet. So it was said that he did not die as it appeared, but that he actually escaped his physical death altogether and was taken to be with God. Well, that's it for chapter 3, but before we move on to chapter 4, let me go into a bit more detail about why I find the whole concept of prophets to be dubious, be they Muslim or Christian or Jewish or whatever. The idea of a prophet is that God imparts his message to a person, and then it's that person's job to share that message with others. But if God is willing and able to reveal his message directly to the prophet, and he wants everyone to get the message eventually, why not just skip the middleman and reveal his message directly to everyone? In other words, why isn't everyone a prophet? If the message of the prophet is so important for us to receive and accept and believe, why isn't everyone a prophet? Geisler and Saleeb mention a few ways in which Islamic thinkers have tried to answer this objection. Prophets are said to be human so that they can be better models, as I mentioned before, for their fellow humans, so that we can relate to fellow humans better than we could to the perfect and untempted God. Prophets are people of remarkable character and intelligence even before they receive their revelations. And while those characteristics are fine for setting prophets apart from the general population, they still don't explain why God needs prophets to spread his revelation. If the idea is that God relies on humans to lead his churches because humans can better relate to each other than they could directly to God, that kind of makes sense. But why does he entrust his divine message to individuals who must then interpret and share it with others in a necessarily imperfect way, when he could easily just reveal that message directly to everyone through divine revelation? In Islam, as in Christianity and Judaism, God is said to be a being of ultimate power. He is sovereign, he is self-sustaining, he is independent, he is unlimited. Nothing is beyond his ability. Everything that happens because he causes it to happen. He is infinite. He can neither be increased nor decreased. It would be no more difficult for God to reveal his message to everyone than it is for God to reveal it to one person or to a handful of selected prophets. And the fact that God supposedly has the power to reveal himself to everyone, but hasn't, makes me very suspicious, not of God, but of those who claim to be prophets. Those who say God has a special message for you, but he didn't tell you, he told me so that I could tell you, can save themselves the trouble as far as I'm concerned. If there is a God and he has something he wants me to know, he can reveal it to me himself. That the God of Abraham, Jesus, and Muhammad chooses to communicate like a child passing a note in class is yet another reason why I wouldn't be a follower of his even if I believed he existed. And what discussion of prophets in Islam would be complete without a look at the prophet in Islam, Muhammad. So let's start chapter 4, Muhammad. Geisler and Saleeb begin with a summary of the life of Muhammad, and this takes up a big chunk of the chapter. I'm going to try to summarize their summary as briefly as I can and hit only the main points. Muhammad was born in Mecca around 570. His family was part of a powerful tribe, but he was orphaned as a young child. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was about 6. And so despite coming from this powerful family, he fell on hard times as a child, and he had to work as a shepherd boy in order to earn a living. At age 12, Muhammad encountered a Syrian monk who recognized him as the final prophet. And the monk told Muhammad's uncle to keep him safe from the Jews because he feared the Jews would try to harm him if they found out who he was, if they realized that he was the final prophet. At age 25, Muhammad married a widow named Khadijah, who was 15 years older than he was. They had 2 sons who died in infancy and 4 daughters. During this period, many people in Mecca had begun to tire of paganism, and they began to turn instead to worshiping the God of the Jews and the Christians. Muhammad began spending the entire month of Ramadan in a cave outside of the city where he would stay alone, eating little and meditating. And of course, eventually, when he became the prophet of Islam, Muhammad would make this a custom for all Muslims to follow. After practicing this meditation ritual for years, Muhammad received his prophetic call from God. He believed that the angel Gabriel spoke to him. At first he feared that this angel was actually an evil spirit that was possessing him, but his wife Khadijah encouraged him and assured him, after consulting with Christian relatives, and a bit of historical irony, that he was receiving a revelation from the same God who had spoken to Moses. And at this time Muhammad was 40 years old when he first is said to have received this revelation. This would have been in the year 610. It was several years before Muhammad began preaching, but when he did, his initial message, which he labeled Islam, which means submission, was very simple: believe in the one true God and give charity to the poor and the orphaned. He attracted a small group of loyal followers, but was opposed by many of the most powerful citizens of Mecca. In the year 619, Muhammad's wife and his close friend Abu Talib, who apparently never became a follower of Islam, both died. It was also around this time, according to Islamic tradition, that Muhammad was taken on a journey by the angel Gabriel, first to Jerusalem and then to heaven. This was Muhammad's night journey. This supposedly happened all in one night. Gabriel took Muhammad from Mecca to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem up to heaven, through the 7 heavens that we mentioned that are a part of Islamic theology in the previous video. There are 7 heavens. Muhammad ascended through all of them, and as he went, he met with past prophets such as Jesus, Moses, and Abraham, and then finally at the end of his journey he stood in the presence of God himself, who gave him specific procedures for Muslims to follow in their daily worship. So one-upmanship of past prophets accomplished, Muhammad. Moses talked to God up on top of a mountain. Muhammad says, I got that beat. I was taken on a magical journey by an angel to Jerusalem, and then all the way up actually into heaven, where I stood in heaven in the presence of God himself, and we chatted about how people should pray and worship him. Beat that. Muhammad's story of his journey to heaven was met with hostility from his enemies in Mecca, and a few years later he and his followers fled to the city of Medina, and Islam was much better received in Medina than it had been in Mecca, so Muhammad's following began to grow. He won followers from various clans of Arabs in Medina, but he never quite won over the major groups of Jews in the city. When the Jews didn't accept Muhammad as a prophet, that's when he became much more critical of Judaism and began to focus much of his preaching and his theology on Abraham as a central figure in Islamic history, rather than Moses, who was emphasized by the Jews, or Jesus, who was emphasized by the Christians. And remember, we mentioned earlier, he framed Abraham as having been neither Jew nor Christian, but simply a true and pure follower of God. Muhammad and his followers supported themselves initially by raiding caravans. In 624, a group of 300 men led by Muhammad attacked a caravan from Mecca led by a great local leader named Abu Sufyan. And though they were outnumbered 3-1, Muhammad's force won what was eventually called the Battle of Badr. The victory was seen as a sign of God's favor, and because of this, Muhammad's prestige grew. After the Battle of Badr, Muhammad began attacking his enemies in Medina, having opponents and critics assassinated or expelled from the city. Over the next several years, more conflicts ensued, and Muhammad's influence and his following continued to grow, culminating in the year 630 with Muhammad returning to Mecca with an army of 10,000 to take control of the entire city. Under Muhammad's leadership, defeated pagan tribes were required to profess Islam, but Christians and Jews in the Muslim-controlled territory were allowed to continue to practice their own faiths, but they had to pay tribute to Muhammad's leadership, to Muhammad's government. And then in the year 632, just 2 years after returning to sort of conquer Mecca, Muhammad died, and it's said that he died suddenly but of natural causes. So, obviously, even people like me who don't really have a lot of specific knowledge about Islam know that Muhammad is by far the most influential, respected, and loved figure in all of Islam. Among more extremist factions, the reverence for Muhammad and the insistence that others, even non-Muslims, regard him with reverence is fanatical. Even when they don't rise to the level of fanaticism, some of the practices inspired by the love for Muhammad can seem excessive and a little strange to those of us on the outside. For instance, quote, "An interesting example of Muslim piety in following the prophetic tradition is found in Sayyid Ahmad Khan, the 19th century Indian reformer who emphatically believed that it was better not to eat mangoes since the Prophet had never touched this favorite fruit of India." Also, it is said that the great mystic Bayezid Bistami did not eat watermelon for 60 years because he could not establish how Muhammad would have cut melons. Of course, Muhammad has a much more substantial role to play in Islamic theology and culture than inspiring what many of us would consider odd customs and neurotic hang-ups about what to eat or not to eat. Muhammad is seen as God's last messenger. The religion he founded, Islam, is viewed by those who practice it as the pure and perfect form of the message God had revealed to all the prophets who had come before Muhammad. But unlike those earlier prophets, Muhammad was not sent to a particular people, but was sent as the prophet for all people for all time. That certainly sets Muhammad apart from those earlier prophets. But one has to wonder, if God intended for Muhammad to be the final prophet and the prophet for all people, and God knew this from the very beginning, because again, Muslims have a very similar sense of God's omniscience and God's all-encompassing control of the universe and history as Christians do. So if God knew from the very beginning that Muhammad was going to be his last prophet and his prophet that would speak to everyone, to all communities, why bother sending all those earlier prophets to their various tribes and communities, especially if their revelations were just destined to be lost or corrupted anyway? Why not just send the perfect ultimate prophet first thing? Somehow, God's protection or whatever, the perfect revelation given to Muhammad has not been lost or corrupted like those earlier revelations were. So why not just skip the earlier ones altogether? You don't publish your rough drafts. Even a writer as shitty as God ought to know that. Despite his uniquely high status among prophets, Muhammad made clear that he was not himself divine. He only claimed to be passing on the message he received through revelation, and said that worship was for God and God alone. This reminds me quite a bit of the false modesty displayed by contemporary preachers, particularly Christian televangelists. Benny Hinn often tells his followers that he's not the powerful one, he is not the special one, he's not the one you should admire, he's merely a vessel for the glory and power of God. And yet I can't help but notice who's always the one on stage having people faint away at the touch of his hand. It's not God, is it? Geisler and Saleeb list 5 reasons found in the book The Mizanul Haq by C.G. Fonder that are typically cited by Muslims to explain why Muhammad ought to be considered superior to other prophets. Those 5 reasons are: 1, his coming was foretold in the Old and New Testaments. 2, the language of the Quran is so beautiful that it alone is sufficient proof of the truth of Muhammad's teachings. 3, Muhammad worked miracles. 4, Muhammad's life and character prove that he was the last and greatest prophet. And 5, the spread of Islam proves that it is the final and true revelation of God. Reasons 1, 3, 4, and 5 are essentially identical to reasons Christians commonly give for why Jesus was so special. They say that his coming was foretold by prophecy, he worked miracles, he was without sin, and the humble, persecuted church, started by those who followed and worshiped Jesus, eventually became a dominant worldwide faith. So there must have been something to it. Also regarding reason 1, just as Jews typically deny that their scriptures contain prophecies referring to Jesus, Christians deny that their scriptures contain prophecies referring to Muhammad. This argument, like most apologist arguments I've encountered, seems like it would only be compelling to someone who was already a believer. And as for reason 2, that the Quran is so beautiful that it must be true, even assuming beauty was an acceptable form of evidence that a thing is true, as in factually true, accurate, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. This sense of truth is objective. Beauty is subjective. It's difficult for me to understand how you would take something that is by its very nature subjective and use that to prove whether or not something is objectively true. And just because one person or a billion people or however many people think that the language of the Quran is the most beautiful writing ever, that doesn't make it objectively true. Because, again, beauty by its very nature is subjective. Geisler and Saleeb end the chapter by drawing an explicit comparison between Islam and Christianity, which they have rarely done to this point in the book. Unlike Christianity, which is founded upon the divinity of Christ, Islam is not founded on the personal divinity of Muhammad, or indeed it's not supposed to be based on the person of Muhammad at all, although Muhammad is greatly admired. It's supposed to be based on the truth of the revelation given to Muhammad, which is called now the Quran. And it is to the Quran that the authors and we will turn our attention in the next video when I look at the next 2 chapters of this book, chapter 5, the Quran, and chapter 6, End Times and Salvation. That will be for the next video in this series. That is it for this video. I want to thank you guys for watching. Remind you, if you did enjoy this video, to please like it and share it. And if you're not subscribed to this channel, subscribe to this channel, please. You'll get more videos like this. And also consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel. And if you are a fan of this series or these An Atheist Reads series overall that I've been doing over the last several years, I would especially encourage you, if you are not a patron at this point, to consider becoming one, because the next milestone in my Patreon campaign is to produce audio-only podcasts of all of the An Atheist Read series that I have done to this point. These will be brand new, fresh, high-quality audio recordings in podcast form of the An Atheist Read series that you guys can listen to in the car, or when you're at the gym, or when you're cooking or doing whatever you do. People have requested for years that I make these videos available in a more convenient audio podcast format, and I am going to do that when I reach the next milestone in my Patreon campaign. So please consider that if you enjoy this work that I do. Thank you again so much for watching, and I look forward to reading your comments, and I will see you in the next video. Take care, everybody.